The smell came before the trucks did. It always did. By the time Hollis Vickers stepped onto the back porch that summer morning, the air over the south pasture already carried it. That thick, fermented sweetness, half molasses and half rot, the kind of smell that settles into your hair and the inside of your nose and refuses to leave. The kind that follows you to school and makes the girl at the next desk wrinkle her nose and scoot her chair 6 inches to the left without saying why. The grass near the fence line had turned the color of weak tea. Flies hung in slow, lazy spirals above the drainage ditch, fat and unhurried like they had nowhere better to be, and knew it. And beyond the fence in the low corner of land, her grandfather had once called the good bottom, a fresh black mountain of crushed cane and mill sludge, steamed quietly in the early heat. She was 16. Her boots were taped at the toe with electrical tape she had stolen from her father's workbench, because he would have told her to wait until next month for a new pair, and next month never seemed to come. Her hands were already chapped from the morning's work, the skin across her knuckles tight and split in two places. And she had been watching this pile grow in one form or another for nearly 6 years. The Ironwood Sugar Refining Company had been dumping there since she was 10. Quietly at first, a single truck once a week, always at dawn, always when the road was empty. Then openly 2 trucks, 3 arriving in the middle of the afternoon with their engines grinding and their beds heaped high. Then with a kind of patient confidence that said no one was coming to stop them. Not the county, not the state, not God. Inside the house behind her, she could hear Hartley coughing. Her brother was 12 and had been coughing like that for 2 years now. A dry, rattling sound that started in his chest and traveled up into his throat and stayed there like a guest who refused to leave the table. The doctor in town had used the word asthma and then looked out the window toward the south pasture and said nothing else. He didn't need to. Everyone in that examination room knew where the air was coming from. The doctor simply did not want to be the one to say it out loud, because saying it out loud meant someone would have to do something, and doing something meant standing across from the Ironwood Sugar Refining Company, and no one in that county had stood across from Ironwood and come away with anything but silence. Hollis stood on the porch and watched a fresh truck back up to the dumping ground, its tailgate yawning open like a tired mouth. The driver wore a ball cap pulled low and did not look toward the house. They never did. They looked at the ground or the rearview mirror or the middle distance where the tree line met the sky, anywhere that was not the farmhouse with its peeling paint and the girl standing on the porch watching them. Looking at the house would mean acknowledging the house. Acknowledging the house would mean acknowledging the people inside it. And acknowledging the people inside it would mean admitting, even if only to themselves, that what they were doing had a cost, and that the cost was being paid by someone specific, someone with a name and a face and a brother who coughed through the night. So they didn't look, and the pile grew. The Vickers farm sat on the soft, rolling edge of a river valley in a county where the cane fields had once been the pride of 3 generations. 80 acres of dark bottomland and sandy upland divided by a creek that ran clear in the spring and brown in the fall, and not at all in the worst weeks of August. A red barn that leaned slightly east, the way an old man leans toward the arm of his chair. Not because he's falling, but because he's been sitting there so long, his body has forgotten what straight looks like. A farmhouse painted the kind of white that had stopped being white sometime around 1994 and was now the color of old teeth. Hollis's grandfather, Drake Vickers, had worked that soil for 41 years. He had arrived on the property as a young man with $80, a pregnant wife, and a conviction that the land would provide if you met it honestly. And for 4 decades it did. He used to walk the bottom field in the spring, bend down, take a fistful of earth, hold it under his nose, and say to whoever was walking beside him, usually Griffin, sometimes Hollis, when she was small enough to ride on his shoulders, "That's what money smells like, kid. Not paper. Dirt." He said the bottom land was so rich you could push a fence post in by hand and watch a sprout climb it by Sunday. Hollis was 8 when Drake died. A heart attack in the barn on a Tuesday morning in March, quick and total, the way he would have wanted it if anyone had thought to ask. Griffin found him on the floor between the tractor and the feed bin, one hand still holding a wrench. 2 years later, the dumping began. Griffin Vickers was not his father. He would have said so himself, not with shame, but with the plain recognition of a man who understood his own limitations. Drake had been a force of nature, the kind of farmer who could read weather and the behavior of birds and diagnose soil deficiency by the color of a leaf at 40 paces. Griffin was steady. Griffin was reliable. Griffin got up every morning at 4:30 and did what needed doing and did not complain and did not romanticize and did not stop. He was the kind of man who fixed the tractor at midnight because the tractor needed fixing and there was no one else to fix it. He carried the same belief his father had carried, that this land was Vickers' land, that no one had the right to take that away, that the dirt under his fingernails was the same dirt his father had held to his nose and called money. But Griffin did not have Drake's voice. Drake could fill a room. Griffin filled a silence, which is a different thing entirely. And in a county where the loudest voice usually won, it was not enough. Winter Vickers held the household together with a kind of quiet ferocity that most people mistook for calm. She canned tomatoes in August, balanced the books in December, drove Hartley to the doctor when the coughing got bad, and never once raised her voice in public. The previous spring, she had sold her mother's hero earrings, the only piece of jewelry she owned, that was worth anything to pay for Hartley's specialist visit in the city. She told Griffin she had lost them. She told Hollis the truth on a Tuesday night, when it was just the two of them folding laundry, and made her promise not to tell her father. Hollis promised. But she saw the way her mother's hand went to her earlobe, sometimes touching the empty place where the pearl used to sit, and she understood that her mother was paying for Ironwood's negligence in a currency that could not be measured in soil tests or property values. Winter was not calm. Winter was controlled. And there is a difference between those two things that only people who have lived close to the edge understand. Before the refinery expanded, the south pasture had been the best piece of ground on the property. The bottom land ran right up to the fence line, black and loose, and smelling of the river, the kind of soil that held moisture through a drought and drained clean after a flood. Drake had grown sweet corn there that stood waist high by the 4th of July, and the ears were so heavy and tight with kernels that you could hear them creak when the wind pushed the stalks. Then a man in a tucked-in shirt arrived one autumn afternoon. He drove a company sedan and carried a leather portfolio and had the kind of haircut that cost more than Griffin's boots. He sat at the kitchen table and explained in a voice that was polite without being kind that the back 40 of the Vickers property happened to sit downwind downhill and conveniently adjacent to land the company had recently purchased for operational expansion. He used the word byproduct a great deal. He used the word temporary even more. The dumping was meant to last a season, then a year, then until the new processing facility comes online, a phrase that Hollis, even at 10 years old, learned could mean anything from 6 months to forever. The piles grew, the drainage shifted. The bottom land that had once grown sweet corn, waist high by July, began to grow thin yellow stalks that snapped in the wind like dry bones. The soil turned sour. The creek ran darker. And the South pasture, the pride of 3 generations of Vickers farming, slowly became a place where nothing good wanted to grow. The well water took on a faint sourness that Winter refused to comment on. She bought bottled water for drinking and used the well water for washing and said nothing when Hollis asked why. Griffin noticed. Griffin noticed everything. He simply did not know what to do about any of it, and for a man like Griffin, Vickers not knowing what to do was worse than any smell, worse than any truck, worse than watching his father's land die one season at a time. He went to the company offices 3 times. The first time he came home angry. He sat at the kitchen table and told Winter about the secretary who made him wait 40 minutes and the office that smelled like new carpet and the manager who shook his hand too hard and called him sir in a way that meant the opposite. He said he'd told them what they were doing to his land, and they had listened politely and said they would look into it. He said, look into it, the way you'd say a word in a foreign language you didn't trust. The second time he came home quiet. He ate dinner without speaking, washed his plate, and went to the barn. Winter found him an hour later sitting on a hay bale in the dark, not doing anything, just sitting. She sat next to him and didn't ask. The third time he didn't talk about it at all. The manager, a man named Abbott Grafton, was not cruel. That was almost the worst part. Cruelty would have given Griffin something to push against the wall to hit a face to remember with anger. But Grafton was simply tired. Tired in the way men become tired when they have learned that nothing they say will ever be questioned, when they have sat in the same chair behind the same desk for so many years that the chair has molded to their shape and the desk has become a kind of shield. He poured coffee from a pot that was always half full. He spoke about regulatory timelines and operational realities and the unfortunate complexities of agricultural runoff. He used words like mitigate and assess and ongoing review, words designed not to communicate, but to fill time until the person sitting across from him gave up and left. Then he walked Griffin to the door, shook his hand with the same too-hard grip, and forgot him before the door had finished closing. What Griffin brought home from that third visit was not anger. Anger he could have used. What he brought home was something worse, the understanding that he did not exist in Grafton's world, that his name, his land, his family, his father's 41 years of work occupied no more space in that man's mind than the coffee he poured and forgot to drink. Griffin had walked in as a man with a grievance and walked out as a man who had been made to understand without a single raised voice or hostile word that his grievance did not matter, that he did not matter. And that realization, more than any insult or threat, was the thing that followed him home and sat down at his kitchen table and would not leave. The night after the third visit, Griffin and Winter argued. Not the loud kind of argument, not the kind with raised voices and slammed doors. The quiet kind, the dangerous kind, the kind where every word is measured and every silence is loaded and the children upstairs can hear it all, because quiet carries farther than shouting in an old house with thin walls. Winter said they needed a lawyer. Griffin said they couldn't afford a lawyer. Winter said they couldn't afford not to have one. Griffin said, those people own half the judges in this county, not just half the land. Winter said if they did nothing, Hartley would keep coughing, the soil would keep dying, and one morning they would wake up in a house no one wanted to buy on land, no one wanted to farm. Griffin didn't answer. He stood up, walked to the porch, sat in his father's chair, and stayed there until Winter turned off the kitchen light. Hollis heard every word. She stood at the top of the stairs in her socks, one hand on the banister, the other clenched at her side. Hartley appeared in the hallway behind her small in his oversized pajamas and grabbed the sleeve of her shirt. He didn't say anything. He just held on. Hollis stood there until the house went dark, then walked her brother back to his room and sat on the edge of his bed until his breathing evened out the inhaler on the nightstand like a small plastic sentry. She did not sleep for a long time that night. About a month after Griffin's third visit to Grafton's office, Dashiell Enright showed up. Enright was the transport foreman for Ironwood, the man who coordinated the trucks, the routes, the schedules, the dumping. He was not like Grafton. Grafton was indifferent, the way a wall is indifferent, simply there, solid, unmoved. Enright was something else. Enright was the kind of man who enjoyed the weight of his clipboard, who stood with his feet apart and his chin up and looked at people the way a man looks at a fence post. He's deciding whether to pull out or drive over. The other drivers never looked at the house. Enright did. The first time Hollis saw him, she was standing on the porch. Same spot, same morning posture, and Enright jumped down from the lead truck, looked directly at the farmhouse, directly at her, and then turned to the driver behind him and said loud enough to carry, "Back it up closer, all the way to the fence." It was the first time anyone from the company had acknowledged the house, and they did it with contempt. The trucks dumped closer that day than they ever had before. The new pile rose so high that from the porch, Hollis could no longer see the south pasture beyond it. The black mountain had become a black wall. Griffin saw it when he came in from the north field. He did not go inside. He walked to the fence line the way his father used to walk it, with his shoulders set and his jaw tight, and he stood there looking at the pile that now towered above the fence posts Drake had set 30 years ago. Then he climbed through the wire and walked toward the trucks. Enright was still there, leaning against the cab, writing something on his clipboard, a man at ease in a landscape he considered his. He looked up when he heard Griffin's boots on the hard ground. "This is my property line," Griffin said. His voice was level, controlled, but his hands hanging at his sides were closed into fists, and Hollis, watching from the porch, could see the white of his knuckles from 50 yards away. "You're dumping on my land." Enright did not step back. He looked at Griffin the way he looked at everything, with the measured assessment of a man who calculates weight and distance and yield for a living and has learned to apply those calculations to people. He shifted his tobacco to the other cheek, spat once into the dirt between them, and said, "You people don't own the wind, Vickers. The smell goes where it goes, and so does this." He gestured with the clipboard toward the fresh pile still steaming, and then toward the fence, and then toward the house, a single lazy arc that encompassed everything the Vickers family owned and dismissed it in one motion. Griffin did not swing. Hollis could see that he wanted to. She could see it in the way his weight shifted forward onto the balls of his feet, in the way his shoulders rose half an inch, in the way the tendons in his neck pulled tight. But Griffin Vickers was not a man who swung. He was a man who absorbed, who endured, who carried things inside until the weight of them compressed his spine and rounded his shoulders and turned him into someone his own daughter sometimes did not recognize. He stood there until the trucks finished, until the drivers climbed back into their cabs and the engines revved and the convoy pulled away down the county road, trailing dust in the sweet, rotten smell of fresh bagasse. Then he walked back through the wire, back across the pasture, into the house, past Winter, past Hollis, past Hartley, into the bedroom, and closed the door. Hollis had never seen her father close the bedroom door in the middle of the day. Not when the tractor broke down, not when the creek flooded, not when the tax notice came, or the well went sour, or Drake died on the barn floor. The closed door frightened her more than Enright's voice, more than the black wall, more than anything. Because the closed door meant her father had found the end of something, some rope he had been holding for 6 years, and he had let go. That night in the dark hallway between their bedrooms, Hartley grabbed Hollis's sleeve again. "Are we going to lose the farm?" Hollis didn't answer, not because she didn't know, because she was afraid the answer was yes, and saying it out loud would make it true, and she was not yet ready for it to be true. The neighbors were not much help. Some of them worked at the refinery. Wade Winslow drove a forklift on the processing floor and had two kids in elementary school and a mortgage, and was not about to say a word against the company that signed his paycheck every other Friday. Orla Mercer's husband was a shift supervisor. The Fessler family had sold their back acreage to Ironwood 3 years ago and considered the matter settled. Some of the neighbors did not work at the refinery, but simply did not want trouble. Trouble was a luxury in a county where the margins were thin and the winters were long, and the nearest lawyer who was not already retained by Ironwood was 45 minutes away in a town most people here had never visited. There was a meeting at the county planning office once 2 years before where Griffin had stood up and spoken about the dumping. He had prepared notes on a piece of lined paper torn from a school notebook. His hands shook while he read them. The room was half empty. The planning commissioner, a heavy-set man in a short-sleeved dress shirt who owed his appointment to the same state representative who had accepted campaign contributions from Ironwood for the past decade, listened politely, made a note on his pad, and said the matter would be referred to the appropriate department for review. Griffin never heard from the appropriate department. He never heard from anyone. The lined paper with his notes on it sat in the glove compartment of his truck for months afterward, folded into a small square, until one afternoon he found it while looking for a registration card and threw it away without unfolding it. When Winter brought it up at the feed store, a woman named Lark Newcomb, who had known Hollis since she was small, who had brought casseroles when Drake died, who had once told Winter that Hollis was the smartest girl in the county, and she meant it, looked at the floor and said, "Honey, that's just how things are now." Hollis was standing right behind her mother when Lark said it. She watched her mother's shoulders go rigid, watched the muscles in Winter's jaw tighten, watched her mother open her mouth to say something and then close it again, the words swallowed back down like something bitter. On the drive home, Winter was silent for 10 minutes. Then she pulled the truck onto the shoulder, put it in park, and gripped the steering wheel with both hands. Her eyes were wet, but she did not cry. Not the full way. Her shoulders shook once, twice, and she breathed through it the way a person breathes through a wave of nausea waiting for it to pass. Hollis reached across the bench seat and put her hand on her mother's arm. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. Winter took one long breath, put the truck in drive, and pulled back onto the road. That was the moment. More than the smell, more than the trucks, more than the yellowing corn and the sour water, and the sound of her brother's inhaler clicking in the dark. More than Dashiell Enright's voice or her father's closed door, or the black wall that had swallowed the south pasture. It was Lark Newcomb looking at the floor. It was a woman who had known her family for 16 years choosing the floor over the truth. It was the entire county, the entire system, the entire machinery of power and silence and convenience captured in a single averted gaze. Hollis understood with the cold clarity that sometimes arrives in the young like a blade that no one was coming. Not the county clerk with his unopened folder, not the state regulators with their timelines, not the neighbors with their casseroles in their silence, not God, not justice, not the slow turning of the moral universe toward the right. No one. She was 16 the day she stopped waiting. It began the way most real things begin, with something small, something easy to miss, something that would not make sense until much later when the whole shape of the story was visible and you could look back and see the hinge. Late September. The kind of warm afternoon where the cicadas sound like a kettle that will not stop boiling, and the air sits heavy and still over the fields like a hand pressed flat against the earth. Hollis was walking the fence line after school, checking for breaks the way her father had taught her, pulling at the wire with gloved hands, testing the posts for rot. She had walked this line 100 times. She knew every dip, every rise, every place where the wire sagged and the posts leaned. She stopped near the oldest part of the dumping ground. This was a section the trucks had abandoned long ago in favor of fresher corners closer to the road. The pile here had collapsed in on itself, flattened by years of rain eaten at by wind and weather, and the slow, patient work of time. Grass had crept across the edges. Weeds had taken hold in the cracks. The surface was no longer black, but gray-crusted, weathered into something that looked less like waste and more like the remains of something that had been alive once and was slowly returning to the earth it came from. And on the south side, half hidden under a curl of decomposing fiber, she saw something that made her stop walking. A tomato plant. Not a sad, struggling, barely alive tomato plant. Not the kind of thin, pale thing that grows in bad soil and produces a handful of hard green fruit that never ripens. This was a thick, dark-leaved, almost arrogant tomato plant, taller than anything in her mother's garden, its stems bent under the weight of fruit so heavy and red and ripe that they looked fake, like something painted onto the vine by someone who had never seen a real tomato and was working from an idealized memory. The leaves were broad and deep green, the color of money, the color of health, the color of soil that has everything it needs and is showing off. Nothing else grew in that field. Nothing. For 100 yards in every direction, the ground was dead or dying, gray and crusted and sour. And in the middle of it, like a flag planted on the moon, this one impossible plant was growing as if it had never heard of failure. Hollis stood there for a long time, long enough for the sun to shift and the shadows to change direction, long enough for the cicadas to go quiet and start again. And in that silence, for the first time in 6 years, she felt something other than helplessness, something other than anger or resignation or the dull gray acceptance that had settled over the Vickers farm like fog. She felt curious. She reached down and picked one of the tomatoes. It came away from the stem at the soft pop, heavy in her palm, warm from the sun. She bit into it right there, standing in the dead field with the black wall of the dump site behind her and the smell of decay in the air and the taste of the fruit flooding her mouth. Juice ran down her chin. It was sweet, sweeter than anything in her mother's garden, sweeter than anything she had tasted in years. She stood there with the tomato in her hand and the juice on her chin and her eyes on the pile, and for the first time in her life, she thought a thought that had never occurred to anyone in her family, anyone in the county, anyone at the Ironwood Sugar Refining Company, anyone at all. If this waste could grow a tomato like this, then it wasn't waste. She put the rest of the tomato in her jacket pocket. She walked home without telling anyone what she had found. That night, she lay on her bed and stared at the ceiling, her hands still smelling of tomato juice, her mind turning the image over and over like a stone in a creek. The black pile behind the fence, the impossible plant, the taste of something sweet growing out of something rotten. It was a puzzle someone had left in plain sight, the answer sitting right there in the open air for 6 years while everyone walked past it. She didn't know the answer yet, but she knew with the quiet certainty that would come to define everything she did from that moment forward, that it was there, waiting, the way seeds wait in dark soil for the season to turn. She told no one. Not that night, not the next morning, not the morning after that. She carried the secret of the tomato plant, the way you carry a coal from a dead fire cupped in both hands close to the body, not yet sure if it was still burning or if you only wanted it to be. The following Tuesday, after the last bell rang and the school buses pulled away from the curb trailing diesel exhaust, Hollis did not walk to the parking lot where her mother's truck idled with the engine running and the radio turned low. She walked 3 blocks east to the Crestfield County Public Library, a flat-roofed brick building that smelled of carpet glue and old paper, and the particular quiet that exists only in places where people come to think. The librarian was a woman named Mrs. Lockwood, small, soft-spoken, silver-haired, the kind of woman who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and knew the Dewey Decimal System, the way a mechanic knows an engine, not from study, but from years of living inside it. Hollis approached the front desk and asked in a voice that was quieter than she intended for anything the library had on composting. Mrs. Lockwood did not ask why. She did not raise an eyebrow or tilt her head or make any of the small gestures adults make when a 16-year-old girl asks for agricultural literature instead of young adult fiction. She simply turned, walked into the stacks, and came back with 3 books. By the end of the week, she had added 4 more. And then she began doing something Hollis did not ask for and would not forget. She started setting aside agricultural extension pamphlets she found in the recycling bin publications from the State University up north that arrived at the library in manila envelopes and were usually thrown away unread. She stacked them neatly on a shelf behind the circulation desk with a small piece of masking tape that said Whitfield in pencil. One afternoon, 3 weeks into Hollis's visits, Mrs. Lockwood pulled a chair next to the table where Hollis sat, surrounded by open books and pamphlets and spiral notebooks filled with handwriting that was getting smaller and more precise with each passing day. "My husband worked at Ironwood for 22 years, Mrs. Lockwood said. She did not look at Hollis when she said it. She looked at the books on the table, at the diagrams of decomposition cycles and soil horizons and microbial populations. He died of something they said wasn't related. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was. The doctor didn't want to be the one to say, and Ironwood didn't want to be the one to pay, and so it just sort of fell into the space between those two silences and disappeared." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I don't know what you're looking for in those books, but I hope you find it." She smoothed her skirt, and walked back to the circulation desk as if nothing had happened. Hollis watched her go and understood with a sudden widening of perspective that her family was not the only one carrying a wound from Ironwood. The wounds were all over the county, buried in medical bills and averted eyes and jobs that paid just enough to keep people quiet. Mrs. Lockwood was not helping Hollis out of idle kindness. She was settling a debt that Ironwood did not know it owed. What Hollis learned in those weeks, slowly the way water finds its way through stone, was that the black mountain behind her house was not garbage. It was not poison. It was not the end of something. It was unfinished. Sugarcane bagasse, the crushed fiber left after the juice is pressed out, is one of the most carbon-rich agricultural residues on Earth. Dumped raw the way Ironwood had been dumping it for 6 years, it is acidic and nitrogen-starved and painfully slow to break down. It robs the soil it touches, stealing nitrogen from the root zone the way a drowning man grabs at anyone nearby. It chokes drainage, compresses into dense mats that suffocate the ground beneath them, and creates conditions so hostile that almost nothing can grow. Almost. But under the right conditions, under the right balance of nitrogen and moisture and oxygen and time, that same waste could become something else entirely. Something the textbooks called humus, a dark, crumbling, sweet-smelling substance that fed soil microbes, held water like a sponge, released nutrients slowly over months and years, and built healthy earth the way coral builds a reef, one invisible layer at a time. Farmers who knew it had a simpler name for it: living fertilizer. The kind that did not burn the soil out the way synthetic nitrogen did, but rebuilt it season by season, year by year, until the ground was richer than it had been before the damage. Compost, Hollis read, was not made by people. It was made by life itself, by billions of microorganisms, bacteria and fungi and actinomycetes and protozoa eating and breathing and dying and being eaten in an endless cycle of consumption and renewal. The compost pile was not a container. It was a body, a living body with a temperature and a metabolism, and something that if you pressed your ear close enough, you could almost call a pulse. When the process was working, when the chemistry was right, you could feel the heat radiating from the center of the pile through your palm from a foot away. The critical number was the carbon to nitrogen ratio, 30 to 1, 30 parts carbon for every 1 part nitrogen. That was the ratio at which the microorganisms worked fastest, burned hottest, broke down organic material into stable humus with maximum efficiency. And the bagasse sitting in those piles behind the Vickers fence was at roughly 150 to 1, starving for nitrogen the way a furnace starves for fuel. All that carbon, all that energy, all that potential locked up and useless because no one had ever bothered to add the missing ingredient. She read about thermophilic bacteria that thrive above 130 degrees Fahrenheit organisms, so heat-loving that they can kill weed seeds and pathogens and disease organisms in a matter of days. She read about turning about aeration, about the critical difference between anaerobic decomposition, which produces the suffocating stench of a swamp, and aerobic decomposition, which produces the clean, sweet smell of a forest floor after rain. One was rot, the other was renewal. The difference was oxygen. And one night, sitting at the kitchen table with her notebook spread before her, while her father slept in the next room, and Hartley's inhaler clicked faintly through the wall, and the house settled around her with the small sounds old houses make when they think no one is listening, Hollis understood something her books had not quite said out loud. The company had not been dumping waste behind her farm. They had been dumping raw material. They simply didn't know it, or they didn't care. She did. She started in October on a patch of ground behind the old equipment shed, out of view of the road and out of sight of the kitchen window. She chose the spot deliberately. She was not ready to explain what she was doing because she was not yet sure there was anything to explain. Hope at that stage was still fragile enough to be killed by a wrong look or a careless word, and she could not afford to let anyone's doubt contaminate her own. The first pile was small, maybe 4 feet across, 3 feet high. She built it the way the extension pamphlets described, with a precision that bordered on reverence. A base of coarse twigs and broken branches for airflow, laid crosswise the way you'd lay kindling for a fire. A layer of bagasse hauled from the dump site in a wheelbarrow, one agonizing load at a time, each trip a quarter mile across the field, and back the wheelbarrow bouncing over ruts and roots, her shoulders burning her grip, slipping on the worn wooden handles. A thin layer of fresh chicken manure from the coop behind the barn. A handful of soil from the woods dark and crumbling and alive with native microbes. Another layer of bagasse. Another layer of manure. Water from the garden hose, but not too much. The pamphlet said the pile should feel like a wrung-out sponge. She squeezed a handful, 1 drop fell. She moved on. Saturday morning, the second week, Hartley found her. She was pushing the wheelbarrow across the yard, her jacket dark with sweat despite the October chill, when she heard the screen door slap and looked up to see her brother standing on the back steps in his pajamas and rubber boots, watching her with the expression of a boy who has discovered something he is not sure he was supposed to see. "What are you doing?" he asked. Hollis set the wheelbarrow begun, wiped her forehead with the back of her glove, considered lying, considered telling the truth, considered the space between the two, which was where most of the important conversations in her family seemed to live. "Helping," she said. Hartley looked at the wheelbarrow full of dark, wet fiber, wrinkled his nose. But he did not ask what she was helping with, and he did not go back inside. He walked to the chicken coop, filled a bucket with manure, carried it to the pile behind the shed, and dumped it where Hollis pointed without being asked. From that Saturday on, he showed up every weekend, small and serious and useful, shoveling and hauling and saying very little. He had his sister's stubbornness, or perhaps his grandfather's. Either way, he showed up. For the first week, nothing happened. Hollis pressed her palm against the side of the pile every morning before school, the way a mother presses her hand to a child's forehead, checking for fever, and felt nothing but cold, damp fiber. No warmth, no activity, no sign that anything inside was alive or awake or interested in becoming anything other than what it already was. She began to wonder in the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, when doubt is loudest, whether she had done it wrong, whether the books were wrong, whether the whole idea was the foolish hope of a 16-year-old girl who had read too many pamphlets and believed too easily in the possibility of transformation. On the ninth day, the pile was warm. She felt it through her glove, a faint but unmistakable heat, like touching the hood of a car that has been sitting in the sun. She pulled her glove off and pressed her bare hand against the side. Warm, not imagined, not wished into being. Warm. On the 11th day, it was hot. She pushed a long steel rod into the center of the pile. The way one of the pamphlets had described, left it there for 60 seconds, counting in her head the way she counted during thunderstorms to measure the distance of lightning, and pulled it out. The metal was almost too hot to hold. She stood in the cold morning air with the rod in her hand and laughed. A short, startled sound, the kind of laugh that escapes before you can catch it, the kind that has nothing to do with humor and everything to do with surprise and relief, and the sudden intoxicating realization that something you built with your own hands is working. She held the rod up and watched the heat shimmer off the metal in the cold air, a faint ripple barely visible like the air above a highway in August. It was alive. She ran inside, grabbed Hartley from the kitchen table where he was eating cereal with a textbook propped against the milk carton, and pulled him out the back door by his sleeve. He stumbled after her in his socks, protesting, cereal spoon still in his hand. She pressed his palm against the pile. He yanked it back. "It's warm." Hollis shook her head. Her eyes were brighter than Hartley had ever seen them, and something in her face had changed, something he could not name but would remember for the rest of his life. "It's not warm," she said. "It's alive." But process is not progress, and alive is not the same as finished. The first setback came in November. A hard, cold front dropped out of Canada and pushed the temperature down 30 degrees overnight. Hollis woke to frost on the inside of her bedroom window and went out to find the outer layer of her pile frozen solid, a shell of ice and crystallized fiber that cracked under her palm. The core kept working, barely, the thermophilic bacteria retreating inward to where the heat still held, but the cooling slowed everything down. She covered the pile with straw, then with an old tarp her father did not know was missing from the barn, then with more straw. She turned it with a pitchfork every 5 days, lifting the cooler outside material into the hot center, folding the pile over on itself the way you fold bread dough, working the cold into the warm and the warm into the cold. Her shoulders ached for days afterward. Her hands cracked at the knuckles and bled into her gloves, and she washed the gloves at night so no one would see. The second setback was worse. In December, a heavy snow fell, and the meltwater soaked the pile too deep, saturating the interior beyond what the microorganisms could tolerate. The oxygen disappeared. The aerobic bacteria, the ones that made clean heat and sweet-smelling humus, suffocated and died, replaced by their anaerobic cousins, the ones that thrived in the absence of air and produced as their calling card a smell so thick and putrid that when Hollis turned the pile the following week, she staggered backward 3 steps and covered her face with her sleeve and stood there in the December cold with her eyes watering and her stomach turning and the knowledge that weeks of work had just gone wrong in a way she could not undo but only rebuild from. She rebuilt. She aerated the pile with the pitchfork until her arms shook. She added dry material to absorb the excess moisture. She adjusted. She adapted. She did not quit. The third setback was not weather or chemistry, it was people. A boy from her class, Forrest Jessup, saw her pushing the wheelbarrow of chicken manure across the yard one Saturday morning while driving past on the county road. Forrest was not cruel, not exactly, but he was 17 and bored and possessed of the particular talent some teenagers have for identifying the most vulnerable point on another person's dignity and pressing on it with both thumbs. By Monday morning, everyone at Crestfield County High School knew. For 2 weeks, Hollis was the manure girl. The name followed her down hallways and across the cafeteria and into the locker room after gym class. Someone wrote it on her locker in black marker, the letters thick and uneven, the handwriting of someone who wanted to make sure it could be read from a distance. The person who wrote it was Senna Davenport. Hollis knew this not because she saw it happen, but because Senna was the only person in school whose handwriting slanted that far to the left. And because Senna was the only person in school who had a reason. Senna's father, Ellis Davenport, worked the floor at Ironwood, drove a forklift, pulled double shifts, came home smelling of molasses and machine oil. Ellis had heard the way men hear things in small towns through break room conversation and parking lot gossip that the Vickers family was making noise about the dumping again. And in Ellis's calculation, which was the calculation of a man with a mortgage and 2 car payments and a daughter who needed braces, noise about the dumping meant attention on the plant, and attention on the plant meant trouble, and trouble meant layoffs, and layoffs meant the end of everything he had built for his family with his hands and his back in 20 years of showing up. He said as much at dinner. Senna heard. And so the next morning in the empty hallway before first period, she uncapped a black marker and made her father's fear into 2 words on a metal locker door. One afternoon in the cafeteria, while Hollis sat alone at the end of a long table with a soil biology textbook propped against her lunch tray, Senna walked over. She stood at the end of the table, tray in hand, and spoke in a voice pitched to carry to the 3 tables around them. My dad says your family's trying to shut down the plant. You know how many families depend on those jobs, but sure go play in your dirt pile. Hollis looked up from her book. She looked at Senna for a long moment. She thought about the words she could say, the arguments she could make, the facts she could lay out about carbon ratios and soil biology, and the difference between waste and raw material. She thought about the tomato plant. She thought about the rod that was too hot to hold. She said nothing. She closed the book, picked up her tray, stood, walked to the other side of the cafeteria and sat down at an empty table near the window. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice, but her hands trembled when she set the tray down and she pressed them flat against the table until the shaking stopped. She did not wipe the words off her locker. She walked past them every morning and every afternoon, and every time she read them, she thought about the tomato plant growing in dead ground, and she kept walking. Mr. Underhill noticed. He was the agriculture teacher, a quiet man with a gray beard and weathered hands, who had grown up on a dairy farm 2 counties over and had come to teaching the way some men come to religion, not through inspiration, but through the slow realization that what he knew was worth passing on. His own farm had gone under in the late 90s, sold to a corporate operation that tore out the hedgerows and drained the pond, and turned 300 acres of mixed pasture into a single field of commodity soybeans. He had stood on the road the day the new owners bulldozed the barn his grandfather had built and watched the roof come down in a cloud of dust and starlings, and he had understood, standing there with his hands in his pockets and nothing left to hold, that knowing how to farm and being able to farm were two different things, and that the world was increasingly designed to make sure the second one was impossible. He had been watching Hollis for weeks the way good teachers watch from a distance, without interference, waiting for the moment when watching was no longer enough. He recognized something in her that he had not seen in a student in 20 years. Not intelligence, though she had that. Not ambition, though she had that too. What he recognized was the particular stubbornness of a person who has been told that something cannot be done and has decided to do it anyway, not out of defiance, but out of a conviction so deep it does not require an audience. He saw her reading the soil biology textbook during lunch, saw the way she turned the pages, not skimming, but studying her finger, tracing the diagrams, her lips moving slightly as she worked through the terminology. The next day, he set a book on her desk without a word and walked away. It was a battered paperback, the cover held on with a packing tape, the pages yellowed and soft with age. An Agricultural Testament by Sir Albert Howard, published in 1940. The founding text of organic composting, written by a British botanist who had spent 30 years in India studying traditional farming methods and had come to believe that the health of soil, plant, animal, and human was one connected chain, and that breaking any link in that chain broke them all. "Read it when you can," Underhill said. Then after a moment, standing in the doorway with one hand on the frame, he added, "If you need help, my barn's got space." Hollis read it twice. She sat at the kitchen table in the evenings after her chores were done, and her homework was finished, and the house was quiet, and she read it the way someone reads a letter from a person who understands them. Howard wrote about the indoor process, about windrow composting, about the ancient cycles of decay and renewal that had built every acre of fertile soil on Earth. He wrote about patience. He wrote about observation. He wrote about the arrogance of modern agriculture, which believed it could replace the work of 1 billion microorganisms with a bag of synthetic chemicals. And he wrote in a passage Hollis underlined twice that the health of a nation begins in its soil. One afternoon after school, she went to Underhill's classroom. She put the book on his desk. He looked up from a stack of papers he was grading with a red pen that was almost out of ink. She asked one question, "How do you know when the pile is done?" Underhill leaned back in his chair, looked at her over his reading glasses, considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, which was more seriousness than most adults would have given a 16-year-old girl asking about compost. "When it stops smelling like what it was," he said, "and starts smelling like where you want to be." She nodded, picked up the book, left. She did not ask for help. Not yet. January was the worst month. The cold deepened. Hartley's asthma worsened. Hollis could hear the inhaler clicking through the wall twice a night now, a small plastic sound that punctuated the silence, the way a dripping faucet punctuates an empty house. Winter found a property tax notice in the kitchen drawer, where Griffin had hidden it, 3 months overdue, the numbers printed in red. And one evening a white envelope arrived from the Ironwood Sugar Refining Company. Not a threat, an offer, a polite, carefully worded proposal to purchase the back 40 acres of the Vickers property at what the letter described as fair market value. Griffin sat at the kitchen table with the envelope in front of him. Winter stood at the sink with her back to the room. Hartley was upstairs. The house was quiet in the way houses are quiet when something is about to break. "Maybe we should sell the back 40, Griffin said. He did not look at anyone when he said it. He looked at the table, at the grain of the wood, at the place where Drake had once carved his initials with a pocket knife when he was 12 years old. Take what we can get, find somewhere Hartley can breathe. Hollis stood in the kitchen doorway. She had just come in from the equipment shed. Her hands were dark with compost, and her boots were muddy, and there was a streak of something on her cheek that might have been dirt or might have been dried tears from the cold wind. She looked at the envelope on the table. She looked at her father. She looked at her mother's back, rigid at the sink. She wanted to tell him. She wanted to say that the piles behind the shed were working, that the chemistry was right, that she had figured out the ratios and the turning schedule and the moisture levels, and that in a few more weeks, the oldest pile would be ready, truly ready, transformed into something that could save the very ground he was talking about selling. She wanted to say all of this, but she looked down at her own hands, cracked and filthy and bleeding at the knuckles, and she realized she had nothing to show him. Not yet. No proof, no results. Just the conviction of a 16-year-old girl standing in a kitchen doorway with dirty hands and a theory. Griffin looked at her. "I know you've been doing something back behind the shed. I'm not blind." Silence. The kind that has weight. But knowing how to rot things doesn't save a farm, Hollis. The words hit her like a hand, not because they were angry, because they were tired, because they came from the one person in the world whose belief she needed most, and they carried in them not contempt, but something worse. Resignation. The quiet surrender of a man who had been fighting for 6 years and had finally accepted that the fight was over. Hollis swallowed, pressed her bleeding hands against her jeans, felt the sting of the fabric against the raw skin. "Give me until spring." Griffin looked at her for a long time. The kitchen clock ticked. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere upstairs, Hartley's inhaler clicked. Griffin did not promise, but he did not sign. He folded the letter, put it back in the envelope, and slid it into the kitchen drawer next to the overdue tax notice. Then he put his hands on the table and pushed himself up the way old men push themselves up from chairs with effort, with the full weight of their years pressing down on their shoulders, and he walked out of the kitchen without another word. Hollis stood in the doorway and watched him go. The drawer was closed. The letter was inside, but the pen was still on the table. By February, she had 3 piles working at different stages. The oldest was dark and warm, and beginning to collapse inward under its own weight, the fibers breaking down the structure, loosening the sharp smell of raw bagasse, giving way to something deeper and rounder. The middle pile was at peak heat, so hot that steam rose from it on cold mornings, and the snow melted in a perfect circle around its base. The newest pile was still raw, still blonde and fibrous, still waiting. By March, the oldest pile had cooled and darkened and transformed into a substance Hollis almost did not recognize as the same material she had started with 5 months earlier. She knelt beside it and dug her hands into it. It was deep brown, close to black, and it crumbled between her fingers with the texture of fine coffee grounds. She lowered her face until her nose was inches from the surface, and she breathed in. Not bagasse, not manure, not waste, not rot, not any of the smells that had defined the South pasture for 6 years. Earth, the honest, ancient, unmistakable smell of healthy soil. The smell her grandfather had held to his nose in the bottom field and called money. The smell of something alive. The smell of where she wanted to be. She filled a coffee can with it, carried it inside, set it on the kitchen table in front of her father. The letter from Ironwood was still in the drawer. The pen was still on the table. Fertilizer, Hollis said. From the back lot. Griffin looked at the can. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he is afraid to believe in, with hunger and suspicion and a hope so old and bruised that it has forgotten how to stand up straight. He reached in and took a small handful and held it close to his face, and then let it fall through his fingers, slowly watching each grain as it dropped, the way his father used to do in the bottom field on spring mornings when the world was still young enough to be kind. Winter turned from the sink. Hartley appeared at the top of the stairs, drawn by the silence, which was a different kind of silence than the ones that usually filled his kitchen. Not the silence of defeat, not the silence of argument. Something else, something that had a pulse. Griffin reached across the table. He picked up the ironwood envelope, folded it once, and pushed it to the back of the drawer. Then he closed the drawer. He looked at his daughter with eyes that carried 6 years of accumulated weight, and he said 2 words. "Show me." The next morning, for the first time in 6 years, Griffin Vickers followed his daughter out the back door and across the yard to the equipment shed. He stood in front of the 3 piles, hands in his pockets, and looked at them for a long time. Then he did something Hollis did not expect. He took off his jacket, hung it on a nail in the shed wall, pulled the pitchfork from where it leaned against the post, and began to turn the middle pile. He did not speak. He did not ask questions. He simply worked the way he had always worked, steadily, without complaint, his back bending and straightening, in a rhythm that Hollis recognized because it was the same rhythm she had been keeping alone every Sunday for 5 months. She watched him. His back was more curved than she remembered. His hair was grayer than she had noticed. His hands on the pitchfork handle were the same hands that had held a wrench over his father's body on a barn floor 8 years ago, the same hands that had shaken Abbott Grafton's hand 3 times and come away with nothing. And Hollis understood that when Griffin said, "Show me," he had not meant "prove it." He had meant, "I'm in." April came to the valley the way it always did, not all at once, but in pieces, a softening of the mornings, a greening at the edge of the tree line, the creek running clear again after the long brown winter, carrying snowmelt down from the hills, with a sound like someone whispering a secret they had been holding all season. Hollis spread her first finished batch of compost across a 1/4-acre test plot near the house. Not the bottomland. She was not ready for that. The bottomland was a wound that needed more time and more material than she had yet produced. She chose instead a smaller patch of ground on the east side of the property, sandy and tired, the kind of soil that had given up on itself 2 seasons ago and settled into growing nothing but chickweed and foxtail and the thin, bitter dandelions that thrive in exhausted earth. She worked the compost in by hand and by hoe, turning it into the top 6 inches, mixing the dark, crumbling material with the pale sand, until the color changed and the texture changed and the soil in her hands felt different in a way she could not have described to anyone who had not held both versions. She planted sweet corn and pole beans and 3 kinds of tomatoes, Roma and Early Girl and Cherokee Purple, the last of which she chose because her grandfather had grown it and because the name felt like an inheritance. Griffin helped. He did not say much about what he was doing or why. He repaired the bean trellis that had been leaning since the previous fall. He dug a drainage trench along the downhill side of the plot so the spring rains would not wash the compost away before it could do its work. One evening, he left something on the kitchen table without explanation. A leather-bound notebook, small and thick, the cover cracked and stained with what might have been motor oil or coffee or the sweat of a man's hands over 30 years of daily use. It was Drake's field journal. Weather observations, planting dates, soil notes, harvest records, all written in a cramped but legible hand that Hollis recognized from the 2 birthday cards her grandfather had given her before he died. She opened to the first page. The ink was faded but readable. The bottom gives everything back if you give it time. She sat at the kitchen table and read her grandfather's handwriting and felt the strange compression of time that happens when you hold an object that was last touched by someone who loved the same ground you love, someone who is gone now, someone whose faith in that ground outlasted everything except his own heart. By the first week of winter, the test plot did not look like the rest of the farm. The corn was waist-high and dark green, the stalks thick and closely spaced, the leaves broad and unblemished. The tomato plants had grown into small bushes, dense with foliage, already setting fruit that hung in clusters so heavy that Hollis had to stake the branches with strips of old sheet to keep them from breaking. The bean vines had outgrown their supports twice and had to be restaked with longer poles climbing with a vigor that bordered on aggression, as if the soil beneath them was so rich that the plants could not contain themselves. The rest of the farm looked like the rest of the farm, thin, pale, tired. The contrast was visible from the road. Hartley came running into the kitchen one afternoon holding an ear of corn above his head. He set it on the table in front of Winter. It was the largest ear of corn anyone in that house had seen in years, heavy and tight, the kernels pressing against the husk so hard that the silk at the top had split. Winter looked at the corn, looked out the window at the test plot, where Hollis was kneeling between rows with a trowel, her back to the house, her shoulders brown from the sun. Winter's face did something it had not done in a long time. Her eyes narrowed and the corners of her mouth turned up and her shoulders dropped an inch, and she laughed. Not a polite laugh, not the kind she used at church or at the feed store. A real one, short and surprised and full. Hartley grinned. Hollis out in the field did not hear it, but Griffin did, standing in the barn doorway with a wrench in his hand. He heard his wife laugh for the first time in longer than he could remember, and he stood there and listened to it the way you listen to a sound you had forgotten existed. What happened next was something Hollis had not planned for and Griffin had not expected. On a Tuesday morning in July, Griffin Vickers put on a clean shirt, combed his hair, got in his truck, and drove to the Ironwood Sugar Refining Company offices for the 4th time. He did not tell Winter. He did not tell Hollis. He waited until the house was empty, and then he left the way a man leaves when he has made a decision that he needs to make alone and does not want anyone to talk him out of it. He brought 2 things with him: a plastic zip bag filled with soil from Hollis's test plot, dark and crumbling and rich, and a second bag filled with raw bagasse from the dump site, pale and fibrous and sour. He put them both in the passenger seat and drove 22 miles to the Ironwood offices with the windows down and the radio off. He did not make an appointment. He walked through the front door and past the secretary, the same woman who had made him wait 40 minutes 3 years ago, and she stood up from her desk and said, "Sir, you can't just..." And he walked past her without breaking stride, the way a man walks past a fence he no longer recognizes as a barrier. Down the hallway with the new carpet, past the framed photographs of smiling executives at ribbon-cutting ceremonies and company picnics, past the water cooler that hummed in the silence, into Abbott Grafton's office, where the coffee pot was half full, the same as always, and the desk was wide and clean, and the chair behind it held the same man who had shaken his hand 3 times and forgotten him 3 times and would not. Griffin had decided during the 22-mile drive with both windows down and the radio off, forget him a 4th time. He set both bags on the desk, one on each side of Grafton's coffee cup. The dark soil from Hollis's test plot on the left, the raw bagasse from the dump site on the right, The difference between the two was visible at a glance the way the difference between health and sickness is visible at a glance if you are willing to look. Grafton looked up. He recognized Griffin. You could see it in his eyes, the slight widening, the flicker of something that might have been guilt, or might have been annoyance, or might have been both. He opened his mouth to begin the familiar routine, the coffee, the chair, the regulatory language. Griffin spoke first. Your waste turned my daughter's test plot into the best soil in this county. I'm not here to complain anymore. I'm here to tell you what you've been throwing away. Grafton looked at the two bags, the dark one and the light one, the finished and the unfinished. He did not reach for either. He did not pour coffee. He did not speak about timelines or operational realities. For the first time in 6 years, he simply looked. Griffin stood. He did not wait for a response. You don't have to do anything. But if anyone comes to dump on my land again, the Agricultural Extension Office and the County Environmental Board will have these samples on their desk by Monday morning. He walked out. No one followed him. No one shook his hand. The secretary watched him pass without a word. He pushed through the front door into the parking lot and got in his truck and sat there for 1 full minute with his hands on the steering wheel before he started the engine. He drove home, walked into the kitchen where Winter and Hollis were shelling peas at the table, sat down, and told them what he had done. When he finished, Winter reached across the table and put her hand over his. Hollis looked at her father and saw something she had spent 6 years trying to create with her compost piles and her books and her bleeding hands. Griffin was sitting straight. His shoulders were back. His chin was level. He looked like his father. The neighbors came in July. Ulrich Sinclair was first. He farmed the place across the road, 120 acres of corn and soybeans, and he had been watching the Vickers test plot from his kitchen window for weeks. One afternoon, he walked across the road, leaned on the fence, and watched Hollis pick beans for nearly 20 minutes. He did not speak. He watched her move between the rows, filling a basket, straightening, moving on. The plants were taller than she was. What are you putting on it? He finally asked. Hollis straightened up, looked at him across the fence. She thought about the years of silence. She thought about Lark Newcomb and the feed store and the averted eyes. She thought about all the people in this county who had chosen not to see what was happening to her family's land because seeing it would have required doing something about it. Fertilizer I made, she said, from the cane waste. Ulrich looked at her, looked across the field toward the black remains of the dump site behind the south fence, took off his cap, ran a hand through his hair, put the cap back on, walked back across the road. The following Saturday, he came back. This time, he carried an empty 5-gallon bucket. You got any extra of that stuff? Hollis looked at him, looked at the bucket. She could have said no. She could have said something about 6 years of silence and empty buckets and what it means to show up only after the work is done. She could have made him feel what she had felt. She nodded, walked him to the equipment shed, filled the bucket. By August, 3 more farmers had stopped by. Each one came alone. Each one stood at the fence for a while before speaking. Each one left with a container of something they did not fully understand but could see the evidence of growing 60 feet away. Also in August, Dashiell Enright came back. He arrived on a Wednesday morning with 2 trucks, the engines growling up the county road the way they had been growling for 6 years, and pulled to a stop at the south fence line. Ironwood had decided to expand the dumping zone. The new target was a strip of ground between the existing pile and the Vickers well, the last clean piece of the south pasture. Hollis was in the test plot when she heard the engines. She set down the hoe she was holding and walked across the field to the fence. Not Griffin this time. Her. Enright saw her coming. He was leaning against the cab of the lead truck clipboard in handball cap tilted back. He recognized her, the girl from the porch. But the girl from the porch had been 15 the last time he'd seen her, small and silent and watching from a distance. The person walking toward the fence now was 17, leaner, taller, with sunburned arms and calloused hands, in a way of moving that said she was not coming to watch. She stopped at the fence post, 3 feet of wire and air between them. "Turn around," she said. Enright laughed. Not a loud laugh, not a mean one, the reflexive laugh of a man confronted by something he does not yet understand. "Kid, go back inside." Hollis did not move. "I have soil test results from the county agricultural extension. I have 3 working compost windrows, turning your waste into the highest quality organic fertilizer in this county. I have a teacher from the agriculture department with 23 years of data who is willing to put his name behind every word I just said. And your boss already knows because my father told him to his face 6 weeks ago." The laugh died. Enright looked at her. Then he looked past her across the field to where the test plot stood in vivid contrast to everything around it. The corn head high in dark green, the tomatoes heavy on the vine, the beans climbing their poles with a force that was visible even from this distance. He looked at that patch of impossible growth the way a man looks at evidence he has been actively refusing to consider. "You're dumping near our well," Hollis said. "If a single truck crosses that line today, the county environmental board will have a complaint and soil samples on their desk by Friday." "That's not a threat. That's a schedule." Silence. The truck engines idled. The second driver sat in his cab and watched and did not get out. Enright looked at the test plot one more time, looked at Hollis, looked at his clipboard. Then he straightened up, opened the cab door, climbed in, and pulled the truck into reverse. The second truck followed. They backed down the county road and turned south toward the plant. Hollis stood at the fence and watched them go. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them against the fence wire until the trembling stopped, and the wire left red marks across her palms. She did not feel triumph. She felt the trembling in her hands and the hammering in her chest and the strange empty quiet that follows a moment you have been rehearsing for months, that turns out when it finally arrives to last less than 3 minutes. But the trucks did not come back. Not that day, not the next, not again. Then the letter arrived. It came on the same day Hollis harvested her first full crop of tomatoes, a Thursday afternoon, so warm that the fruit was almost hot to the touch when she pulled it from the vine. Hartley was helping, carrying a wooden crate between the rows, and the crate was so full that he had to walk slowly to keep the tomatoes from rolling off the top. The kitchen table was covered with red and yellow and purple fruit, and the house smelled like summer for the first time in years, like something growing instead of something rotting. The mail carrier left the envelope in the box at the end of the driveway. White envelope, Ironwood Sugar Refining Company logo in the upper left corner, law firm address beneath it. Hollis saw it before her father did. She carried it inside and set it on the table next to the tomatoes, and the contrast between the two objects, the fruit she had grown and the letter that wanted to take it away, was so sharp that for a moment she could not move. Griffin opened it. His face went the color of chalk. The letter stated that the Vickers family had been collecting and utilizing company property, specifically sugarcane processing byproduct, without authorization. It requested the immediate cessation of all such activity and invited the Vickers family to discuss appropriate compensation for materials already consumed. Winter sat down slowly. Hartley stood in the doorway with tomato juice on his fingers and asked for the second time in a year, "Are they going to take the farm?" Hollis picked up the letter, read it twice, set it down, went to the equipment shed. On the workbench tucked into the back cover of Howard's book was a scrap of paper Mr. Underhill had given her the last day of school. his home number written in the same careful hand that graded exams. In case you need anything over the summer, he had said, and she had kept it the way she kept everything useful quietly without ceremony, in a place where she could find it when the time came. She dialed the number on her father's phone. He answered on the second ring. Underhill came the following Saturday with a soil testing kit borrowed from the county agricultural extension office. He spent the morning taking samples, 16 of them, from the test plot, from the bottom land, from the original dump site, and from 3 of Hollis's active compost windrows. He labeled each sample with a grease pencil and packed them carefully into a cooler. He drove home, ran the analysis using equipment the school district had purchased for the agriculture program and never used, and came back the following weekend with a manila folder and a legal pad covered in numbers. He sat at the kitchen table with Griffin and Winter and Hollis for nearly 2 hours. He spread the test results across the surface next to the tomatoes that were still coming in, and he walked them through the numbers with the patient precision of a man who understood that what he was saying mattered more than anything he had said in 23 years of teaching. The soil in Hollis's test plot had nearly 3 times the organic matter of the surrounding fields. The microbial activity readings were higher than anything he had measured in his career. The nutrient profile was complete: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, trace minerals, and a living biological community so dense and diverse that it would take a university lab to fully catalog. What your daughter built behind that equipment shed, he told Griffin, his voice quiet and steady, is a complete organic soil amendment. Everything a field needs to recover, grow, and sustain production for years. All of it pulled from material the company was paying to get rid of. Then he opened the manila folder and took out a second set of papers. I looked into their legal letter, he said. Under federal environmental regulation, once waste material is deposited on private property without a valid disposal agreement, and Ironwood never had one, the landowner retains remediation rights over that material. They dumped it illegally. Hollis didn't take their property. She remediated their environmental liability. If they push this in front of a judge, they'll have to explain 6 years of unauthorized dumping on private land, contamination of a residential water source, and potential violations of the Clean Water Act. He looked at Griffin. I've already called a colleague at the State Agricultural Extension Office. He wants to come see the windrows. And I've spoken with the County Environmental Board. They're interested in the soil test results. Griffin looked at Underhill, looked at Hollis, looked at the manila folder and the soil test numbers and the tomatoes on the table in his daughter's hands, which were calloused and scarred and strong in a way they had not been a year ago. Griffin stood up from the table. He walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the test plot at the corn his daughter had grown from soil his father's land had been poisoned with, and he pressed one hand flat against the glass, the way a man presses his hand against something solid to make sure it is real. A week later, Senna Davenport found Hollis after school, not in the cafeteria, not in the hallway, in the parking lot behind the gym where no one could see them. Senna looked different than she had in January, thinner, darker circles under her eyes. The braces she had gotten in the fall were gone, not because the treatment was finished, but because the insurance had lapsed. My dad got laid off last month, Senna said. She did not look at Hollis when she said it. She looked at the asphalt. They're cutting shifts. Turns out the plant's in trouble anyway, with or without your family. Silence. The parking lot was empty. A bird sang somewhere in the trees behind the school, oblivious. I'm sorry about the locker. Hollis looked at Senna. She remembered the black marker. She remembered the cafeteria and the voice pitched to Carrie and the trembling hands on the lunch tray. She remembered walking past those 2 words every morning for weeks and choosing each time not to wipe them away because wiping them away would have meant they had the power to hurt her, and she had decided somewhere in the cold months between November and March that they did not. She did not forgive Senna, not in that moment. Forgiveness was not something Hollis gave quickly or easily, and she did not pretend otherwise. But she recognized something in Senna's face that she recognized from her own mirror. Fear. The specific fear of watching your father lose the thing that defines him and not being able to do anything about it. I know your dad's name, Hollis said. If Ironwood starts composting instead of dumping, they'll need people who know the plant and know the material to run the operation. Tell him to talk to Mr. Underhill. Senna looked at her. Something moved across her face, quick and unreadable. She turned and walked away. But Hollis saw her shoulders shaking as she crossed the parking lot, and she understood that some wounds close slowly and some never close at all, and the best you can do is stop making them deeper. The man from the company came in October, not Abbott Grafton, a different man, younger, wearing a suit that fit better than anything Hollis had ever seen in Crestfield County. He had a quiet voice and a leather portfolio, and the careful posture of someone who has been sent to clean up a mess he did not make. He stood in the yard with a clipboard and asked in a tone that was polite in a way that was actually polite whether the Vickers family would be open to a conversation about the materials on the back lot. Hollis answered the door. She stood on the porch and looked down at him and felt the full weight of everything that had led to this moment. The smell that came before the trucks, the black mountain, her father's closed bedroom door, Hartley's inhaler, Lark Newcomb's averted eyes, the tomato plant growing in dead ground, the books in the library, the rod that was too hot to hold, the frozen pile, the rotten pile, the words on her locker, the coffee can on the kitchen table, Enright's truck reversing down the county road, the letter from Ironwood and the letter from the law. Her father driving to Grafton's office for the fourth time with 2 bags of soil and a spine that had remembered how to be straight. She had imagined this moment. In the bad months, the cold months, the months when the piles were failing and the locker said what it said, and her father was reaching for the pen, she had rehearsed speeches. Angry ones, righteous ones, the kind that end with a door slam and a turn back. None of them fit now. They were costumes made for a girl who no longer existed. The girl on the porch was not angry. She was not triumphant. She was tired and strong and calm in the way that only people who have built something with their own hands out of material everyone else called garbage can be calm. You can talk to my father, she said. He's in the barn. Then before the man turned to walk across the yard, she added, and tell Mr. Grafton he should come see this himself. He should see what his byproduct became. What followed over the next 2 years was not a courtroom victory. There was no public reckoning, no front-page article, no dramatic collapse. The Ironwood Sugar Refining Company did not fall. Abbott Grafton did not lose his job. Dashiell Enright was transferred to a construction outfit in the next county. Hollis heard about it secondhand and did not think about him often, so sometimes standing at the fence where they had faced each other, she remembered the moment his certainty had cracked, the moment he had climbed back into his truck and driven away. Not because she had won, but because he had run out of reasons to believe he was right. That moment she thought was the closest thing to victory she had ever experienced, and it was enough. The dumping stopped. The site was cleared at the company's expense, not because a court ordered it, but because the soil test results and the county environmental board's interest in the state extension office's involvement had shifted the calculation. The cost of fighting was now higher than the cost of cleaning up, and men like Grafton understood cost the way they understood coffee. It was the language they lived in. Hollis was paid modestly for a consulting role she did not ask for and would not have requested. The university up north sent a graduate student, a quiet young woman named Rosalind, who wore rubber boots and took more soil samples in 3 weeks than Underhill had taken in his entire career. Rosalind spent 2 months at the Vickers farm, sleeping in the spare room, eating dinner with the family, and following Hollis around the windrows with a notebook and a digital thermometer and an expression of barely contained academic excitement. She told Hollis one evening, sitting on the porch after dinner, that the microbial diversity in the Vickers compost was unlike anything she had seen in a commercial operation, that the soil food web Hollis had built was more complex than systems that took professional composting facilities years to establish. Hollis did not know what to do with the compliment. She looked at her hands and said, "I just followed the pamphlets." Rosalind laughed and said, "The pamphlets don't explain what you did. You figured out the rest by yourself." A regional farming magazine ran a small article with a photograph of Hollis standing next to one of her windrows, her hands in her pockets, her face serious, the caption underneath reading, "Local teen turns mill waste into premium fertilizer." Griffin cut out the article, bought a frame from the hardware store in town, and hung it above the kitchen sink where Winter could see it while she washed the dishes. Winter did not say anything about the article, but she left it there and she did not move it, and sometimes in the evenings Hollis would catch her mother glancing up at it with an expression that was not quite pride and not quite relief, but something older than both. Something that had to do with endurance and with the particular satisfaction of watching a wound begin to heal. One Saturday afternoon in the second year, a car pulled into the Vickers driveway. Not a company sedan, a personal vehicle, modest American, the kind of car a man drives when he is not trying to impress anyone. Abbott Grafton got out. He was alone. No clipboard, no portfolio, no secretary. He wore khakis and a plaid shirt, and he looked smaller than Hollis remembered the way all authority figures look smaller when you see them outside their offices, separated from their desks and their titles and the architecture of power that makes ordinary men seem larger than they are. He walked to the test plot and stood there. The corn was head high. The tomatoes were heavy on the vine. The soil was so dark it looked almost purple in the afternoon light. He found Griffin in the barn. "I should have listened," Grafton said, "the first time you came to my office." Griffin looked at him. The two men stood in the barn where Drake had died, surrounded by tools and hay and the smell of diesel and the accumulated memory of 3 generations of Vickers labor. The light came through the gaps in the siding in long diagonal bars that illuminated the dust in the air. Griffin nodded. It was not forgiveness. It was not absolution. It was acknowledgement. The recognition that a wrong had been done and that the man who did it had finally found the words to say so, and that the words, though late, though insufficient, though unable to give back the 6 years that had been taken, were better than the silence that had preceded them. Some things arrive late and are still worth something. Not everything, but something. Grafton left. Griffin stood in the barn for a while after. Then he went inside and ate dinner with his family and did not mention the visit. Hollis knew about it because she had seen the car from the equipment shed. She did not ask. Some conversations between men are private, and she understood that her father needed this one to belong to him. The bottomland took 4 more years to recover. Hollis worked it the way her grandfather would have, slowly, patiently, season by season. She spread compost in the fall and turned it in during the spring and planted cover crops in the winter and let the soil rest when it needed to rest. She did not rush. She did not force. She listened to the ground the way her grandfather had listened to it, not with instruments or textbooks, but with her hands and her eyes and the quiet attention of a person who understands that the earth operates on its own schedule and that the best thing a farmer can do is show up, do the work, and get out of the way. The soil responded, not immediately, not dramatically, but steadily, the way a sick person recovers one good day at a time, one clear morning, followed by another, the color returning the strength, rebuilding the systems that had been damaged, finding their way back to function. By the time Hollis was 22, the bottom field was the darkest, richest piece of ground within 50 miles. Farmers drove from 3 counties away to see it. The state extension office used it as a case study. The graduate student Sarah published a paper. Mr. Underhill retired from teaching and spent his free time at the Vickers farm walking the windrows with Hollis, discussing soil biology with the easy shorthand of 2 people who have shared a language for years. Hartley was 18 now. I had tall, healthy. The inhaler had been gone for 2 years, ever since the dump site was cleared, and the air above the south pasture became air again, instead of poison. He was applying to agricultural colleges and writing his application essay about composting, and Hollis had read 3 drafts and corrected the science in each one without telling him. On a morning in early spring, Hollis walked out to the bottom field alone. The sun was just coming up. The air was cold and clean and smelled of nothing except earth and dew and the faint sweetness of the creek running clear along the property line. She knelt down and took a handful of soil, held it close, pressed it between her fingers. It was black and loose and alive, teeming with organisms she could not see, but could feel a warmth and a weight and a texture that told her everything she needed to know. She looked back toward the house. The red barn still leaned east. The farmhouse was white again, truly white, painted the previous summer by Griffin and Hartley, working side by side on a Saturday while winter brought them lemonade and supervised from a lawn chair. Hartley was standing on the back porch, now tall and unhurried, drinking coffee from a mug that had belonged to Drake. People asked Hollis sometimes what the lesson was. Reporters, students, the occasional visitor who made the drive out to the valley to see the farm that had turned waste into wealth. They wanted a clean answer, a thesis statement, a moral that fit neatly into a headline or a caption or a social media post. She did not have one. She was not the kind of person who believed in clean answers. Clean answers were for people who had not spent 5 months watching a pile of garbage turn into soil, who had not rebuilt a failed experiment in December with numb hands and cracked knuckles, who had not stood in a high school cafeteria with a trembling lunch tray and chosen to walk away instead of fight. Clean answers were for people who had not lived the mess. But on quiet evenings when the light was going down behind the barn and the swallows were cutting low across the pasture and the air carried nothing but the smell of healthy ground, she would sometimes say something close to this: "The land does not lie. You can lie to it with chemicals and shortcuts and the desperate mathematics of men who need next quarter's numbers to look better than last quarter's numbers. But the land itself does not lie. It tells you exactly what it is if you are willing to listen, and it gives you exactly what you give it, no more, no less, with a patience that makes human patience look like impatience. Patience is not the same as waiting. Waiting is passive. Waiting is sitting on a porch hoping someone will come. Patience is active. Patience is building a compost pile in October and turning it every 5 days through a winter that wants to kill it and rebuilding it when it fails and turning it again and again and again until the chemistry is right and the biology is right and the time is right. Patience is not the absence of action. It is action repeated so many times that it becomes invisible. The people who shout the loudest are almost never the ones who change things. The ones who change things are usually standing somewhere off to the side covered in dirt, working on something no one else can see, yet too busy to shout and too stubborn to stop. And anything called waste is usually only waste because no one has bothered to understand it yet. She kept a piece of paper tacked to the inside of the equipment shed, pinned with a thumbtack to the wooden beam above the workbench, where she stored her soil testing supplies and her turning schedule, and the battered copy of Howard's book that Underhill had given her and that she had never returned and that he had never asked for. The paper was yellowing now. The handwriting on it was hers copied from a book she had read at the kitchen table on a cold night when she was 16 and the world was dark and the only warmth in her life was coming from a pile of rotting cane fiber behind a shed. The words were George Washington Carver's, the agricultural scientist who had built an entire career on the conviction that humble things, peanuts and sweet potatoes, and the red clay soil of Alabama contained extraordinary possibilities that the world had overlooked because it was too proud or too busy or too blind to look. Anything will give up its secrets if you love it enough. The cane waste gave up its secrets. It gave up its carbon and its nitrogen and its silent biology. And it became the richest fertilizer in the county, the material that rebuilt a dead field and saved a family farm and turned a girl that her classmates called the manure girl into someone that agricultural extension offices across the state wanted to learn from. The land gave up its secrets too. It told Hollis everything Drake had always said it would if you held it close enough and long enough and loved it enough to listen. And the girl gave up her secrets, though she would never put it that way about herself. She would say she got lucky. She would say the books taught her. She would say her grandfather's soil did most of the work. She would deflect and minimize and change the subject the way quiet people do when the spotlight finds them, because quiet people do not want the spotlight. They want the work. They want the smell of good earth on their hands and the knowledge that something they built is growing. She just kept turning the pile every Sunday, alone in silence while the rest of the county went to church or watched football or sat on their porches and talked about the weather. She turned the pile, and the pile turned into soil, and the soil turned into food, and the food turned into proof that the quiet way, the patient way, the way that does not shout or threaten or hire lawyers or buy politicians, is sometimes the only way that lasts. The world did not come to Hollis Vickers. She did not go to the world. She stood in one place on 80 acres of valley land that her grandfather had loved and her father had nearly lost and her brother had coughed through and her mother had held together with silence and strength, and she did the work. Day after day, season after season, year after year, until the world slowly, grudgingly, one skeptical farmer and one soil test and one clear dump site at a time came around to where she'd been standing all along.